Hello, everybody, and welcome to our second spring webinar on a different group of plants, the Yellow Magnolias. I'm Tim Boland from the Polyhill Arboretum. First off, I want to say I hope you're all well, and your extended families well. I hope you're out in the garden on this beautiful day at some point enjoying plants. This is a story of plants, obviously, and people. And it's a story that kind of threads its way through the Polyhill Arboretum with Polly's work and others. So we'll get started. Ann Quigley, I want to thank for arranging this webinar. I do want to mention, excuse me, that if you could hold your questions to the end, we will get to you at the very end of the webinar. So thanks again for joining us. The outline of the talk is this: discovering magnolias and magnolia files. That's a story of me discovering magnolias in a personal way and the people along the way who I've met that have influenced magnolia cultivation and the wider use and appreciation of magnolias. So simply, they're called magnolia files. Secretly, I'm a quercephile, oakophile, so we'll just put that out there. We'll talk about diversity and conservation. One thing you may not be aware of, but half the magnolia species in the world are threatened with extinction. So that's something we are concerned about as an arboretum and botanic garden. We'll talk about how old magnolias are, over 100 million years old in the fossil record, one of the first flowering plant families. And we'll talk about how botanic gardens and arboreta have captured magnolia diversity in their gardens in what we call a reunion of trees. We'll talk about special species, particularly the ones that made up the yellow flowering magnolias. It's a curious tale of species. We'll talk about the people who made it possible to have these trees. They're magnolia breeders focused on bringing new cultivated varieties to gardens from nurseries. The Magnolia Society International, every plant group, it seems, of large size has their own society. I would encourage you to become a member of the Magnolia Society International. I believe you're all members of Polyhill at the very least, but Magnolia Society throughout its 50, 60-year history now has changed the dynamic of not only getting magnolias into gardens, but preserving them in their habitats. Magnolia books, there'll be a few that I'll recommend, particularly a new one that came out recently, which is the best for gardeners. And then we'll talk about how to cultivate magnolias. It's not as easy as you might think in some instances, particularly on Martha's Vineyard, and then nursery sources of magnolias. So let's get started. I did want to mention, oops, I went ahead. I haven't had a lot of time to practice. So in fact, I finished just about an hour ago, been very busy, but let's begin the story of the people who what I would call our magnolia heroes, at least to me personally, and even in a wider sense in the horticultural world. Up on the left, I hope your left, is a picture of Polly Hill, the originator of the Polyhill Arboretum. And this is a picture in 1990 of Polly receiving the Scott Medal, the Arthur Hoyt Scott Medal from the Scott Arboretum at Swarthmore College. And that medal goes to exemplary horticultural career people like Polly Hill who have changed the dynamic of horticulture in the United States. It's considered the premier award for horticulturists. Standing next to her was the then director of the Polyhill Arboretum, the Scott Arboretum, Judy Zook. Judy went on from the Scott Arboretum to the directorship or president of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden from 1990 to 2005 and changed the dynamic of that garden. Judy also was the first person to hire me out of college as a curatorial intern. And I wanted to mention that my own introduction to magnolias came from Judy. I worked in Michigan as a student. There weren't that many magnolias in Michigan. It was so damn cold. One day, Judy, who was the director, as I mentioned, came into the plant record area, and I was making plant labels, and said, "Do you want to look at some magnolias?" And I said, "Absolutely." So we went down in the collection, and we're there for 2 hours. And the thing that made Judy so different and wonderful is that she was a real plants person. Not somebody who, maybe came out of the business field necessarily, but she knew how to manage people. And that particular day, 2 hours after being with her, I became a Magnolia file. And Judy would help me throughout my career, and a few other people who I'll talk about in this webinar. Down below is Steve Spomberg, our first director at Poly Hill in 1998 to 2004. Prior to Poly Hill, he was a horticultural taxonomist at the Arnold Arboretum for 28 years, where he wrote the definitive monograph on magnolias. And what that is, it's an assemblage of all the knowledge of cultivating magnolia species from North America and Asia. And he wrote the beginning papers. And so Steve really changed the dynamic and helped people understand the relationships of plants. In the center is a former board member of the Poly Hill Arboretum, Philippe de Spoorburg. He was on our board for 12 years. He also funded the curator position at the Poly Hill Arboretum, and I was the first curator in 2002. Philippe has what I believe to be the finest arboretum in the country in Brussels, Belgium, just north of there. It's called Arboretum Westpilar, and he has created the most magnificent collection of magnolias that I've ever come upon. He's a phenomenal plantsman, a plant breeder, and several of his introductions will be looked at today. His history is kind of interesting. His family was the original owners of Stella Artois, the brewery, and then later his brewery consortium would become the largest in the world. So a man of great capacity, and he knows a lot about beer, which is always a plus. In the right-hand corner, the original OGs, myself with the two other rare birds. It's the heath hen, and it's Pat Kalina. And Pat used to be the vice president of horticulture and science at Brooklyn Botanic Garden and a proponent of magnolias, the vice president of horticulture and park operations at the High Line in New York City, and now he is a designer and consultant with his own business. And then there's Andrew Bunting, who is the past president of the Magnolia Society and the author of a new fabulous book called The Plant Lover's Guide to Magnolias. He is currently the vice president of public horticulture at the Pennsylvania Horticulture Society. Down below is our first curatorial intern, originally from West Tisbury here on the island, and now curator of living collections at the Morton Arboretum, and that's Matthew Lobdell. And Matt is currently on the board of the Magnolia Society and their registrar. So these are people who are woven through this story, and let's get going. I have asked for permission and received permission to use these beautiful illustrated drawings or paintings by Barbara Uzzarelli. In 2005, she contacted Steve Spomberg, and they worked together with Jim Gardner, another Magnolia person, to produce this beautiful book, Magnolias in Art and Cultivation. And Barbara received information from me, and then when I was at the Magnolia Society, to put together the descriptions of the cultivated varieties. So she allowed us to use her paintings today. She sells these paintings at a great price. The book is reasonably priced. You should own it if you're into magnolias. Magnolias, there are a lot of them, but as I mentioned before, they're not doing so well. They're worldwide in their distribution. Only half are preserved in arboretum and botanic gardens right now. Currently, though, if you go down to the right-hand corner, you can see 48% are threatened with extinction, mainly through agriculture, habitat destruction, and actually magnolias are used medicinally for various things, so they're exploited. But I wanted to tell you that's a role of botanic gardens and arboretum and the Magnolia Society, preserving these trees from extinction. And just learning that half of them are under vulnerable conditions is kind of tough. Magnolias of China are magnificent, and many new species over the last 12 years have been cultivated in botanic gardens. I received this book in 2002, The Magnolias of China. It's phenomenal. It's all in Chinese, but the descriptions are in Latin. Just there's incredible diversity of species we don't even know that are out there. Here's a few of the rare species of China. Steve's work, A Reunion of Trees, it influences Yellow Magnolias because it gives us clues as to which plants can be crossed. His book, A Reunion of Trees, is out of print, but you can still find copies on Amazon. And it's the story about how botanic gardens and arboreta have brought back these disparate species of plants from Asia and North America, brought them together into cultivation, into collections, and essentially created a reunion of trees. So this monograph, Magnoliaceae, that's the family of magnolias, is really the quintessential early monograph that describes these relationships, and still probably the most referenced paper. So just to go back in a little bit of botany, and I think it's cool for you to know, when I say go back, maybe 60 to 80 million years ago, this is what the continents look like here. And you can see the circle around here. North America used to be attached to Asia, and there was a broad, very similar forest dynamic going on of many, many tree genera that we know: dogwoods, magnolias, tulip trees, beetlebungs, maples, birches, fringe trees. Essentially, they were all very similar, but as we see over here, our current situation with the continents, and we know about continental drift and the geology of what happened. This is 50 to 80 million years ago. This is now. When these tree genera separated, they speciated. So they became, through time and isolation, separate species. However, when you bring them back into cultivation in botanic gardens and arboreta, they will hybridize with each other because they, in fact, haven't been that far separated genetically. So it's kind of a cool story, and it's part of Steve's book. This also goes with animals as well. All right, back to our story. These are the species that Steve had helped describe, and they're at the Poly Hill Arboretum. You see Magnolia obovata with this beautiful red. All these flowers are incredible. Magnolia Julian, this is a picture from yesterday of Macrophylla Julian, our most famous tree, and Magnolia officinalis from China. So these plants brought back into cultivation will hybridize with each other, and Steve's monograph goes into great detail about this. I wanted to mention a spontaneous hybrid that happened that Poly Hill noticed, and that was Magnolia David, and it was named after David Hamilton Smith from a plant that Polly discovered at the Arboretum. We were founded in 1998, and our benefactor was David Hamilton Smith. So Polly decided to name a tree after him, and what she discovered is our native Magnolia tripetala and Magnolia officinalis biloba, which is right here, had hybridized in our garden to produce this unique flowering tree called David. So that is something that tells the story of the past relationships with trees. I wanted to tell you, though, for the Arboretum, it's been a tough road to hoe here because our Magnolia Grove at the entry of Holly Park, where all these species are, is afflicted with a deadly fungus called armillaria. It's called crown rot or shoestring root rot. It's already killed 4 trees in that area, and the David Smith Magnolia lost all of its upper branches 3 years ago. So we thought this tree, like the others, was going to die, which would be tough. So we cut the top off, and this is something you would not do at home as an arborist. I just chopped this tree in half, and many of our visitors went, "Wow, you guys are butchers." But it turns out that once we did that, our reasoning was it was dead, number one, but just to get these to sprout out these other branches. And so what we've done with those branches is air layer them. And this is a propagation experiment where you cut the cambium layer and you wrap it around, you skin the bark and you wrap it around with a bag, a dark bag like this to exclude light. You fill it with milled sphagnum moss. The tree is still photosynthesizing and drawing water, but because of this dark area, and then you add additional hormones to it, they sprout out in root. And I'm happy to say that this is a picture of the David Magnolia this morning in the homestead border that was propagated by Bridget Reed. She did a fabulous job, and cultivated by our gardeners. So we preserved the David Magnolia, this special hybrid that's in our border. And I think it's kind of cool that 20 years after Polly named it, we were able to actually plant a clone of it and save the tree. I wanted to mention Steve Spomberg, our Director Emeritus. He moved off island this year, and he's doing well with his wife, Happy. He was the director from 1998 to 2004, but in 2011, Steve was given the Todd Gresham Award, which is the top award by the Magnolia Society for contributions to magnolia science. And so here's Andrew Bunting with Steve. Andrew was the president of the Magnolia Society at the time. I was the register. And Richard Figler, or Dick Figler, who many believe is the most knowledgeable person in the world of magnolias. He took Steve's monograph and later would modernize it. So it was an honor to have him, his wife, and the board members giving Steve this award. Let's talk about yellow magnolias and how they're made. You would be surprised that it comes from a forest tree. When I say a forest tree, it's a large tree that appears in the Appalachians, and that's Magnolia acuminata, also known as Magnolia acuminata is a cucumber magnolia, because the fruits look like cucumbers when they are in the green stage. Here they're turning in the fall. The painting shows that. The tree itself grows like a tulip tree with a very straight trunk, up to 125 feet tall in the wild. It's a North American native. And while it's not a pure yellow, it's a creamy white color with these really beautiful bluish cast tepals. Flower petals in magnolia are called tepals. And this is the source of the yellow and yellow magnolias. Here is the distribution of Magnolia acuminata, and I've actually seen it up in these areas in upstate New York and in Ontario. It actually also has a variety called subcordata, which only gets about 30 feet, which actually has more yellow flowers and is also part of the breeding process. So a North American native tree was the key to unlocking the yellow magnolias. Where did it start? Well, it started at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden in 1956, the Kitchewan Research Center that was managed by BBG. Three incredible plant scientists, Eva Marie Sperber, Lola Cording, and Doris Stone, are responsible for the first look and detailed crossing of American species with Asiatic species in this program. So I think it's pretty cool that they were involved with this. And what their work resulted in was the first yellow magnolia. So here are some of Barbara's paintings. Magnolia acuminata was crossed with two different Asiatic species, Magnolia liliflora from China and Magnolia denudata, the Yulon magnolia, which is just a beautiful, beautiful magnolia. Denudata is one that blooms before the leaves emerge, and it can sometimes be frosted. Liliflora, at times it blooms when the leaves are leafing out, but acuminata, you hardly notice the flowers. So what they were hoping for is pushing the bloom cycle out later, because these two other species are precocious or bloom earlier and subjected to potential frost. So the goals were to adjust this flowering period so they get beyond the frost problem. The hardiness of Magnolia acuminata growing all the way up into Ontario shows you it's super hardy. It's variable in habitat with subcordata as part of the mix, only growing 30 feet. Clean foliage, propagation. One of the key things is you can make a new plant from a hybrid, but if you can't propagate it, then you're really not going to be able to distribute it. And then, of course, it wasn't the #1 thing they were going for, yellow flower color, but it was a byproduct of this and an intentional cross. There is the cross that's named Brooklynensis, straight with Magnolia liliflora. That is part of their breeding program. So many fine plants are in that group. Okay, not the very first, but nearly the first magnolia, I would say, released and popular is the Elizabeth magnolia. And here's a picture of the original plant that Pat Kleina shared with me at Brooklyn Botanic Garden. It's a beautiful, beautiful tree. It was released in 1977, and it's a cross of acuminata with denudata. You can see it flowers before the leaf out, kind of a creamy yellow color. It was named in honor of Elizabeth von Brunk, who was a donor to the Kitchewan Research Center. It still remains one of the more popular yellow magnolias. If you are traveling, any of you, to the Arnold Arboretum in early May, you can see a magnificent specimen in front of the administration building. Well, how plants get their names, I wanted to mention, I was a registrar, Matt's a registrar. Essentially, you have to describe the plant using the Code of Botanical Nomenclature for Cultivated Plants. It's an international registrar. Polly Hill was involved with it early on. I was involved with it, and Polly Hill now, I am the registrar for Stewardia now. But the original founders of the Magnolia Society go back to 1964, John Fogg and J.C. McDaniel. And then through time, Jack and then Peter Daltredici at the Arnold Arboretum, Dorothy Calloway, a taxonomist, myself, and Matt have carried on this tradition. How you do it is kind of interesting. They're often from other countries, fill out a sheet, a form in great detail, but I thought you'd enjoy. What you do is you describe the colors of the flowers using these color charts from the Royal Horticulture Society. They have a blue-green series, a yellow-green group, a yellow-orange group, and you match up the floral color with these different code numbers, and you get into the nitty-gritty of describing the plant. Also, part of it is making sure there's more than one plant. That's kind of an interesting thing. If you register a plant in a single private garden, and then that private garden, the owner passes away or sells a house, if it's not in propagation, it won't be registered because that tree may not live on. Oops, sorry. So this is the first newsletter in 1964. It was called the American Magnolia Society. Now it's called the Journal of the Magnolia Society International, and that's where these plants are described. You can go to the Magnolia Society website to learn more about cultivated varieties of magnolias. The checklist has just been revised by Matt Lobdell. And when you go, you'll find a PDF, and you can open it up and you can read about all the different cultivars. And there's over 1,000 listed in this. And amazingly enough, are you ready? There's over 200 cultivated varieties of yellow magnolias. From 1956 to the present, there's been a ton of work going on. Not all of them are in production. Not all of them have made it into the trade, likely because they're not worthy, and that's kind of what happens. Matt just put this PDF out. It goes back, it's the 3rd edition to 2020. I was involved up to about 2008. I wanted to mention just briefly, one of the discoveries I made working with magnolias early on at the Polly Hill Arboretum for the Magnolia Society was to find out that Jack Fogg, the founder of the Magnolia Society, got his PhD at Harvard by doing the flora of the Elizabeth Islands, the islands that are right around Martha's Vineyard. And anyway, so I thought it's kind of an interesting connection. He was amazing. He would go on to be the director at the Morris Arboretum and the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. Back to yellow magnolias. This is Elizabeth, as I mentioned. BBG put out more than one yellow magnolia. Another one that is beautiful and more diminutive is named Lois. And this is a plant Pat sent me some information on this named in honor of their board chair, Lois Carswell. It's a plant that flowers a little bit later than Elizabeth. It's what they call a sister seedling or sibling. It has a deeper color. It's a little bit later and it's more diminutive. It's a smaller tree altogether. And this one has stood the test of time. And it was bred by Lola Cording, who in 2011 also won the Gresham Award by the Magnolia Society for all of her work. Another one that's popular that they produced is called Yellowbird, which is Eva Marie with acuminata, variety subcordata, compact yellow flowering, typical of Magnolia acuminata. The leaves are kind of puckered. It's a tall tree, 40 feet tall by 30 feet wide. This was bred by Doris Stone of BBG. It's pyramidal and fast growing. My personal favorite goes back to Judy Zook. I have a picture of myself from many moons ago, 1986, at the Scott Arboretum, and that's Judy. And that was the day I found out that I got into WISLE, the Royal Horticulture Society's fellowship, a year-long fellowship. And Judy made that possible. And so her tree, named in her honor, was established by the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. Pat Kalina was working there at that time and provided all the information about this tree that came from BBG. It's become immensely popular. It has kind of an orangey color with a plum base. It's just a fabulous tree. We planted it in our collections this past year. One of the hard things for people in the Magnolia Society and public gardens when you lose leadership. And Judy went on to an incredible career from 1990 to 2005 at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, but really tragically had cancer, breast cancer, and she passed away in 2007. So that was a tough thing for us, all involved, but her hiring me and Pat and other people kind of influenced the Poly Hill Arboretum to start their own curatorial internship, which has been very popular, and we've had one since 2008. This is an article about Judy right after she passed, and here's a story about her Magnolia, but also they named the Brooklyn Botanic Garden Central Magnolia Plaza in her honor. So she's somebody who still today is influenced us in positive ways. In 1990, I met a very interesting man in Michigan. I was a plant propagator at Michigan State University. His name was Phil Savage, and he lived in Bloomfield Hills, which is a suburb of Detroit. He had a really curious garden. It was about an acre, a little bit more, in a suburb, and it must have had 50 trees in it. The purpose of his garden was plant breeding. And so Phil produced this magnificent cultivar, which still today is one of the most popular, called Butterflies, just from the look of the flowers on the ends of the branches. It's 25 to 30 feet tall. It's not that wide. It's kind of narrow. Phil produced several great magnolias. This is a picture of Magnolia butterflies, very hardy plant. A lot of his plants were bred for hardiness because he was in Michigan. This is taken at the Morton Arboretum by Matt Lobdell a few weeks back. The other one he produced is called Maxine Merrill, and you'll notice in a lot of these clones and crosses, which I'm not going to go into great detail about, but some of them have been perpetuated as part of other crosses. So Elizabeth is used in a lot of crosses, and Miss Honeybee, when you see that, that's a Magnolia acuminata variety subcordata cultivar. And Miss Honeybee has been used repeatedly to try to lower or create a smaller magnolia, because a lot of these acuminatas can get 50 feet tall. So this one was crossed with Magnolia lobnerii Merrill, which you might know if you're a Magnolia person, has kind of strap-like petals that are loose and shaggy. But in this case, Miss Honeybee made these petals more stiff and has a beautiful, beautiful deep color. So I really like Maxine Merrill. We have it. In fact, Matt Lobdell planted it at the Poly Hill Arboretum in 2008. Gold Star is another one of Phil's. If you know the star magnolia, Magnolia stellata, this is a cross between Magnolia stellata rubra and Miss Honeybee, so it's meant to be diminutive. It's about 20 to 30 feet tall, and what it gets from the star magnolia, these strap-like petals, starry petals, in kind of a soft, creamy color. It's a beautiful tree. We have it here at Polly Hill. I wanted to mention another plant breeder, Augie Kerr, or August Kerr from Hendersonville, North Carolina, who passed away in 2001. This is his most famous introduction, called Daybreak. Every magnolia person you talk to will tell you that it's a top 10 magnolia. We have it at the Arboretum because I was talked into it being a top 10. Here's a painting of it. Augie was actually a very close friend of Polly Hill. Many of his letters are in our archives. And Augie was a rhododendron breeder first before he really got into magnolias. But once he did, he created some beautiful yellow magnolias. You'll notice that a lot of his magnolias are in botanic gardens and arboreta throughout the country. One of his most famous is Sensation, which you see here, which has a little bit of the Judy Zook thing going on. It's Magnolia brooklynensis woodsman from the BBG and Elizabeth brought together, and very beautiful upright flowers. Philippe de Spoorburg, I mentioned his involvement with magnolias and Polly Hill Arboretum. He has what I think is one of the more popular and one of the best recent releases, Magnolia Daphne, after his partner and wife. It's a cross of Miss Honeybee and Gold Crown. Both of these are superb plants to cross because they both bring great color and dynamics to a tree. Here he is at Arboretum West Pilar, and this is in 2010. I spent a week there. It was like paradise. The trees were just magnificent. The collections were amazing. He continues to breed and introduce new plants into the trade. You might notice here Augie Kerr's involved. So Augie Kerr used to send pollen and or seed to many people, and he sent the seed of Daphne. I mentioned the cross earlier, and Philippe and his director Kuhn named it Daphne in I think 2004, so I can't remember. Anyway, it's 8 to 12 feet tall. I think it's actually taller than that ultimately. I think it'll probably get about 20 feet tall and maybe 10 feet wide. A beautiful deep yellow. We have one at the Arboretum that was planted 2 years ago. We offered it in the plant sale and it sold out immediately. Another one he's involved with from Augie is Annie Lou, which is a cuminata crossed with Elizabeth. This is a bigger plant, but also a really beautiful color and larger flowers than Daphne. Honey Liz is another one of Kerr's that came about through Kuhn and Philippe selecting it at Arboretum West Pilar. I should mention that both Annie Lou and Honey Liz are not widely available. Daphne has been the one that's been propagated more often and distributed, and I think is a superior tree to both of these. I should mention that Miss Honeybee was selected from an Ohio nurseryman and really is a fine plant. This one is in the trade, and it is the variety I mentioned, subcordata specifically, that plant, so it's smaller. So it's 30 feet tall, as subcordata is about the top range of it by 10 feet wide. Miss Honeybee has been used in many, many crosses, so mostly for both the yellow color and the smaller size. All right, I've rounded through a lot of yellow magnolias fairly quickly. Thanks for your patience. But I wanted to talk to you just about some recommended books. Jim Gardner, former president of the Magnolia Society and director of Wisley in England, produced one called The Gardener's Guide that is fantastic, still available today. Dorothy Calloway in the early 90s produced a book called The World of Magnolias, and that's actually the first book I ever owned on magnolias and pretty fabulous. The Magnolia book that we use the illustrations of today in Art and Cultivation by Gardner, Sponberg, and Barbara Uzzarelli is about $100. It's a big book, but it has incredible cultural information and individual information on all the yellow magnolias, or not all, but many of the best ones, and several others. When I talked to her about a month ago, she told me she has another magnolia book in production that's going to talk about new varieties, cultivated varieties. The book to buy, though, is the one by Andrew Bunting, my good friend. It's called The Plant Lover's Guide to Magnolias. It's produced in association with Kew, the Royal Botanic Gardens. It's a book that actually is so appealing to gardeners because it talks about using magnolias in design, which ones are best for spring flowering, which ones are best for wet areas, which ones are best for small gardens. So I'm sure we can twist Andrew's arm to come and give a talk about magnolias and have him bring his book to sign, and we'll try to arrange for that. But anyway, it's a terrific book. If you're serious about magnolias, and now everybody who's attended this is now, I hope, you might want to own this book. How do you grow magnolias? Cultivating the yellow ones is similar to how you would grow most magnolias. I would tell you, though, that in warm areas of the country, hot areas like Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, the blooms have less colorful impact. In our region, the yellows really show through, and in colder areas with cooler climates. That's something you'll notice. Magnolias do need sunlight. There's not many true woodland magnolias, so at least 6 hours of sunlight or high dappled shade. On Martha's Vineyard and other parts of the country, we get intense winds here in particular. And when you have a beautiful, delicate blossom and it gets shredded by the wind, the best thing you can do is protect it or put it in a protected spot. They like slightly acidic soils. Protect them from deer. Deer will rub the bark, deer will eat the foliage. We all know about those creatures. Bark cracking, this is a problem. Magnolias typically have thin gray bark. On a very cold day, it could be 15 degrees. The bark itself might climb up to about 70 degrees. And when that happens, between the inner bark and the outer bark, you might get bark cracking, also what's called sun scald. To prevent that, Polyhill and the Arboretum and many magnolia growers wrap the tree trunks with a white papery covering, and that reflects the sun and stops it from heating up. We usually put that on in and around early December and take it off in about the end of April, mid-April. So you can overcome that. They like to be fed, that is, and mulch. So we mulch each spring with 50% compost and pine bark. Any tree except the most drought tolerant should be watered deeply in times of drought, not surface watered. Actually put your hose on, put your timer on your phone and let it trickle. Just work for about 30 to 40 minutes at the base of a tree. That's deep watering, helps get the roots deep into the soil. They don't need a whole lot of pruning. The same thing goes with most trees, dead, diseased, or dying branches, or maybe cross branches, but you don't want to cut out the central leader if you can avoid it to ruin its form. Magnolia scale is the largest North American scale when you read about it, and it's fairly big. You can see it on the twigs, mostly on the secondary growth from the year before. That can be a problem. You can address that with dormant oil applications to help alleviate that problem. And then I showed you earlier, which is a problem, not just with magnolias, but oaks and other things. Armillaria or honey fungus infects the roots and the base of trees and causes dieback. So those are the things to take notice of if you're growing magnolias. I want to say thank you to a number of people and for setting this up, which I really truly appreciate. The new technology for us is happening and we're adjusting. Magnolia Society International, I enjoyed my time on their board and working with them. My good friends Andrew Bunting, Pat Kleina. I didn't mention this man, but Larry Langford was the person who turned over the Cultivar project to me in a database form, and we were able to put it on the web together. Matt Lobdell for all of his great work and his continued great work on behalf of the MSI. He's also a Poly Hill Arboretum Research Associate. Dick Figler, incredible. And any question I have, he's been able to answer. Phil Savage, who passed away many years ago, was a tremendous Magnolia file. Philippe, both Philippe and his foundation for supporting Poly Hill Arboretum and the curatorial position in the past. Steve Spomberg for his contributions, not just to Magnolias, but to Poly Hill. And then, of course, Judy Zook. I want to thank all those folks. I do want to tell you, it's going to be a natural question. It's like, where do we get these? I want them. I can tell you one thing. First, always go to your local nurseries. And I always say this, if you get 2 to 3, 4 or 5 people asking for Magnolia Elizabeth or Judy Zook or Miss Honeybee, they will respond. And at least on Martha's Vineyard, we have fabulous nurseries, and they're very accommodating to get trees in for you. Poly Hill has at times trees from wholesalers that we grow on a year. We have to get ahead of the game on the new Magnolias to have them in stock, but we'll continue to bring them to our membership. You can go to the Magnolia Society website for mail order, list of mail order Magnolias, and also gardens where you can go see Magnolias. I do want to mention the Scott Arboretum, Swarthmore College has the Plant Collection Network National Collection of Magnolias. You go there mid-April, you'll just be blown away. So make sure to visit your local botanic garden and arboretum, and that includes Poly Hill. I also want to mention to our members, our plant sale is online this year, and people are buying plants, and we're very, very pleased to say that this is working for us and appears to be working for you. Thank you to our membership for sticking with us during this unusual, unprecedented time. And thank you for everybody for being here today, listening to my Magnolia talk and enduring it. Anne and I are going to attempt to answer your questions via, I believe, the chat button. So if you have questions, please send them forth. There's Barbara Dupre. Hi, Barbara. I know this person. Raised her hand. I can't see the questions. Can you, Anne?
Well, if anyone has questions, click in the Q&A area, and
Okay.
I'll read them and Tim can answer them. So let's see. A nice comment from Julie Jenny. Thanks for mentioning the Scott Arboretum, Tim, and thanks for this interesting program. So good to see you.
Yay. Hi.
So nice.
Thank you.
And Angel Morris was asking about the Judy Zook Magnolia, but I think Tim answered it after that. Barbara, if you had a question, go ahead and type it in. And if people have questions after the fact that they think of, you can email info@polyhillarboretum.org and we can get to them after the fact. Okay.
Got a few here that are popping up.
Yep. Okay. So it looks like we've got a first one from Daphne Cunningham. Is there a particular magnolia that does well on MV with wind and salt air?
Yeah, actually the best one is Magnolia acuminata, and probably the best one in that situation would be Miss Honeybee. That's for the straight species. It's subcordata, but that would be probably the best one. And it shows a little bit on, we have 2 giant trees of acuminata, and this is kind of a smaller version. So I think that's the best bet for our local conditions, Miss Honeybee.
Okay. Our next question is from John Varto. Do the trees outgrow the deer risk via size?
Yeah, so we cage our trees up to about 8 to 12 feet. And then we have to spray deer spray. One thing, John, though, which you probably are aware of, another thing you can do to help your tree in the winter and starting in the fall is wrap it with a plastic tree wrap, and that prevents deer from browsing the tree, or buck rub is what we call it, specifically buck rub. And but eventually, when say reach a certain size and their bark gets a little bit tougher, we let them free. That usually is when they're 15 years or older.
All right. Jane Lewis says, thanks for a very interesting talk. What is the blooming period here?
Well, depending on the species, for the yellow magnolias, they start to bloom right about the third week of April. No, right around, I would say, May 1st, and they last to right around June 1st for the yellow magnolias. There's other ones that are earlier, but those are susceptible to frost. Those like things like Magnolia salicifolia, the anise magnolia, and some of the species like Magnolia zenii. But the yellow ones pretty much from May 1st to June 1st.
All right. So Barbara Dupree, I have a sensation that I grew a new magnolia from seed this year. What are the chances it will be yellow?
Oh, you have a sensation and you collected seed off of it. I don't know. It depends on if it would be hybridized. What will happen if it selfed itself, which it probably did if you don't have multiple magnolias. Uh, it's probably edging towards 50% or more. You have a good shot at it. You'll have to wait till it blooms, which will be about 7 to 8 years. Sorry about that part.
An interesting experiment if you have patience.
Yeah.
All right. So Ben Hall asks, well, great program. We bought our house off Oak Lane in West Tisbury, and it had a 3-foot tall magnolia that has full sun, but it's still only 3 feet tall. Should I move it? What kind of soil prep should I perform to give it the best chance? Should it grow to at least 15 feet tall? And I guess we don't know what type of magnolia it is.
No, but I think what you should do is I live, 2 streets over, and you have what I call state soil, gravel on top of sand. So what your tree is missing more likely is organic matter. So I would transplant it maybe to a slightly more protected spot, and then you can do that now actually. And when you actually backfill the hole, add organic matter. You can get it from anywhere locally. You can use Vermont composting and different things. Mix it back into the backfill. Plant the tree back, and you might have to stake it, but plant it back in the ground, and then mulch it with, there's a really wonderful Vermont compost company mulch that you can buy at all the nurseries, and mulch it with that. And then really start to look after it in terms of watering. And I think those 3 things will help you get your tree reinvigorated and growing.
Great. And it looks like in the chat we've got a question from Angel Morris. Is Magnolia virginiana, I think that's what it says, the only native, or are there others? And does it do well on MV?
Yeah, actually, there's no native magnolias on Martha's Vineyard, but Magnolia virginiana, which is called the swamp magnolia or sweet bay magnolia, it actually was discovered in and around Milton, Massachusetts, a population growing there. So it is native to Massachusetts in just one spot. I find it to be a superb tree, and I promote its use. It's blooming right now at our house, and it has incredible lemony fragrance. It's generally a small tree, but Angel, what I do is I really give it a lot of water. And so because it's called swamp magnolia and grows in wet conditions, I just do that, that whole thing I talked about, deep watering, where I take a hose, put it on a trickle and leave it for 45 minutes. And I do that quite often. And our tree, which I planted in 2007, is now probably 22 feet tall and doing fairly well. But that's the way to get that plant to grow for you. It's a great tree. Oh, actually, I forgot. I should mention the Daphne. That's a salt tolerant tree as well, Magnolia virginiana, but you just have to water it more than normal.
All right, good to know. And then Angel was asking a follow-up question. Are you planning another webinar, Tim?
I hope to do one on Asiatic Stewardias, and I'm going to try to maybe see if our plant recorder might join me on that. I would talk about the Asiatic Stewardias in cultivation, and I'm hoping we can talk about a new project, which is a cultivar checklist for the Stewardia, very similar to the Magnolia one. We're producing an international checklist, and Liz has done a fantastic job, Liz Thomas, and we could talk about the history of Stewardia at Poly Hill, particularly the Asiatic ones, and then hopefully Liz could also chime in a bit about the process of developing the cultivated variety list that we have, which will be hopefully published in Horticultural Science someday. Yeah, so I'm going to do more. Inevitably, I'll do one on oaks too, probably in September.
Great. I think that's all we've got for live questions. If anyone thinks of anything after the fact, feel free to email info@polyhillarboretum.org.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm so appreciative of your time today, and also members of the Arboretum, we're appreciative of your support. So thank you.